Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Seaweed Brain, a Percy Jackson podcast. We have something very new and very different for us today that you should already know about. It's time to get into Circe.
Woohoo!
Stick around.
Okay, welcome everybody back to Seaweed Brain, a Percy Jackson podcast. In theory, we will have been on a bit of a 5th birthday anniversary break for the past couple of weeks, so thank you for being back here. As we said, it is historic, unprecedented times here at Seaweed Brain, and we are going to be covering a book that is not by Rick Riordan, nor by a Rick Riordan Presents author on the actual podcast, which probably hasn't happened since like 2020 because we've moved a lot of our extra content over to Patreon. But as you would know if you listen to our schedule update Circe Odyssey Summer episode, we are doing this because we are preparing for the Sea of Monsters season of Percy Jackson TV. We're looking at adaptations of the Odyssey. You may be asking yourself, well, Erica and Carter, the hosts of this podcast who didn't introduce themselves, why are you reading adaptations? Why aren't you reading the actual Odyssey? Didn't you want to cover the actual Odyssey on the podcast? And the answer is no, we didn't want to read poetry. However, because I'm sure you're asking yourselves that, we brought here someone today who has read the Odyssey to help us kick off this book properly. Emily Garber from the Monster Donut. Say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody. I have read the Odyssey once or twice.
And aren't you covering the Odyssey on your podcast?
Yes, that's the eventual plan, gearing up to Sea of Monsters, is to do an in-depth analysis of the Odyssey. Although that's probably not going to be for a few months at least. So we've got the King Chronicles and Magnus Chase to go. So we're still working through it.
Well, there you go. If you're like, I don't want to read Circe until I've read Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, you can go over to Monster Donut. If you're ready to read Circe and talk about chapters 1 through 6, then hang out with us today so we can meditate on what it means to be the first of your name and what it means to... What do you guys think this book is about? I wanted to ask before we start, and then we can revisit it at the very end of this journey of Circe, what you think this book is about, because I think there are so many different themes at play, like missions that Madeline Miller is on with this book. I think I know what my answer is for now, but I want to hear from you guys. If you had like one word about what this book is about, what would you say?
One word?
Yeah.
Women.
Oh.
I think it's about women.
Can you do the Saoirse Ronan, Joe March hands while you say that?
I don't know. I haven't seen that movie in long enough. I don't think I know the reference.
It's a GIF that's commonly used as well. She's in the attic of the original March household, talking about how she's so lonely. And she goes, women.
Seems relatable to Circe. Yeah.
There are many times throughout my book that I wrote the note Joe March over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
It's true. Emily's answer is women. Carter?
One word. I think mortality, maybe. I don't feel super confident about that, but that's what I'm going to go with for now.
That's why we're starting. We have time to get to a different place maybe by the end. My answer, I think, is Bible.
Mm-hmm.
That's so funny. The other thing I was going to say was like the anti-Odyssey, like the opposite of great defining civilizational or text.
I think I'm saying Bible for the same reason that Carter is saying mortality, though, because I think that this is a book that teaches us how to live our lives and what it means to be mortal on Earth.
I like that.
Circe as a goddess who is coming down to live amongst the mortals and figure out what it means to have a finite existence. It's basically the New Testament of the Bible, but first person and better. Dare I say. Don't come for me.
No, I think it's definitely better than the Bible.
Yeah, they didn't have enough copy editors on that.
I tried to read that thing. I would get bored in church growing up, and I'd be like, can I bring a book? And my mom would be like, there's a book literally right next to you, Emily. Why don't you open it?
Great book is right there.
And I opened it, and I got to the first section where it was like, baguettes. And I was like, this is not a book. This is an encyclopedia.
Lord of the Rings, like found dead in a ditch.
Flash forward to hitting the catalog of ships in the Iliad, though, and I was like, no.
Well, yeah, I'm sure we'll have discussed this a lot on the schedule update episode like we talked about. But like Carter said, this book being the anti-Odyssey, the anti-Odyssey also works. If the Odyssey is like the hero's journey, typical male structure of a story, and that is where we get a quest story from, and that is pretty much what Sea of Monsters is and what the second season of the TV show will be. that being like a male story structure of starting in one place, kind of going up to the climax, the top of the mountain, and then finishing somewhere else. Circe is absolutely more of a feminine structure, and I'm putting that in quotation marks. A feminine story structure being something that, as opposed to starting one place and like climbing up that mountain of climax and ending, think about it like a giant spiral, circling the same idea over and over and over again, like a corkscrew, until you are so close into the thing. I think about it like a spiral that's bigger on the top and smaller on the bottom, like a cone.
Like a whirlpool.
A whirlpool, yeah. For a naiad, that's great. I love that imagery. You get closer and closer and closer to the thing until you're like right on the thing itself, but you have like encompassed everything around it, all of the themes that surround it and the relations and the ideas, and then eventually you're just like right at the core of the thing, which I don't know about you guys, I personally find to be more interesting and more exciting.
Yeah.
I'll co-sign that.
Now, since we're here, we can talk a little bit about personal background with this book before we dive into chapter 1. Would you like to start us, Emily?
Yeah, so, well, I love Circe, like the character. Like, I read the Odyssey a lot when I was growing up, and I've always loved the sorcerer. I think Medea is my favorite Greek mythological character, but I do love Circe too. I just love Medea because she just like appears out of nowhere, creates extreme chaos, and then runs away on dragons. Like, that's kind of goals. But Circe as well, I feel like in the Odyssey is such an interesting character. I think that part of the book too is such an interesting one because it's like such a respite, and it's the first time Odysseus like hits an island where there's the horror experience, but then they like stay and actually get something out of it. It just creates this nice little kind of almost midpoint for reflection in the book. I don't know, I always just really enjoy it. Plus, who doesn't love magic?
It's also a midpoint of reflection for Percy and Annabeth in the Sea of Monsters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this book itself is just a giant point of reflection for Circe.
It's all the midpoint for her.
I first read this book in 2020 and I loved it, and I haven't touched it since, but I think I've been telling people that it's my favorite like contemporary fiction novel ever since, and I have had a really great time rereading it so far. It's just as good as I remember it being. I
read it recently, relatively. I want to say last October, maybe, after years of being told that it's one of the, great contemporary fiction novels.
By me.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly when I read this, but I read it after I read Song of Achilles. I think it had come out semi-recently, like maybe that year. But I really like this one. I think this is my favorite over Song of Achilles of her books, for sure.
Oh, for sure.
Strong agree. Strong agree. Emily, I know you just said Circe is like a kind of this like respite point of reflection midway through the Odyssey. Is there anything else you think as an expert that we should know about Circe within antiquity before we read this book?
Yes. Actually, last time I was on here, I was yapping a bit about how witchcraft and like specifically sorceress women in mythology were sort of viewed by the ancient Greeks. And Circe is very much a part of that, and I would say a huge part of that. Like, I think her and Medea really, and then Calypso sort of. Not as much, though. Like, it's really those two that sort of, to me, have always represented, because the thing about them is they're always, like, foreign women living off far away at the edges of the world. And something that's kind of interesting about like witchcraft itself as a concept, it's hard to say exactly how it fits into specifically like ancient Greece, but it's something that I think that in our society is also very closely associated with like the mysteries that are always sort of more associated as more like domestic and feminine. The fear of witchcraft, I think, represents like an existential fear of women having knowledge, essentially, and women being able to kind of like mess with you like from their place of oppression in society. And I think in the ancient Greek world as well, it was so misogynistic for so much of it. They kind of represent this like existential fear of like what happens if a woman has the power to change and shape things. And there was nothing more terrifying than a vindictive, independent woman in ancient Greece. I think it always speaks to that existential fear of like social hierarchy of like what will happen if the people we have done horrible things to get power, because surely then they will do to us what we have done to them.
Yes. Within the context of the Sea of Monsters, I think if we think about Medusa's portrayal in the TV show versus in the book, we can deduce that Circe in the TV show will probably be a little bit different than what she necessarily was in the book, which isn't to say that she was like a flat line or anything in the original book, but I do think that she'll probably be given a little bit more of a story in the TV show. But it's interesting to think how the original ideas of what it means to be a witch play onto this book and this like retelling in Circe's own story, and how that will play onto Circe's portrayal in the Sea of Monsters.
I know.
I have a quick follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we think about the Sea of Monsters depiction, to me, it's like a very it is in line with everything I had heard about Circe previously and after, more or less, which is a person who kind of slots pretty neatly into the vaguely modern femme fatale construct. Someone who is using vague sexuality and power in a way that men find mysterious and difficult to understand, but is also kind of emotionally removed in a way where like she's come to these conclusions about men, and then after that point, she's not really like vulnerable or personally involved and in the same ways as other people might be, that like she's entrancing these men, but that like she doesn't really have skin in the game. Do you feel like that's consistent with your understanding of what people were thinking in the old days?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I feel like the description you gave to me almost rings more like at least the first part of like femme fatale, who's sort of just there to kind of lure you away, like feels a bit more like almost reminiscent of Calypso. Versus, I don't know, that Circe is I think, I'm trying to separate the Odyssey from this book in my head a little bit, but I feel like I remember and always think of Circe as being a little bit more like, it's the moment when Odysseus kind of comes to her and reveals, like uses, spoilers, for this book. But I feel like there's sort of a power shift in their interaction that happens when they kind of become equals almost. And I feel like it is a more equal relationship to me in the Odyssey between the two of them. Yeah, it's an interesting one because I feel like in the Odyssey, like each sort of vignette is essentially a horror short story that's a big like reversal of like all of these things you could be afraid of sailing around Greece and stopping on these random islands, which you would have had to do for survival because most Greek islands are not big enough to like grow sustainable agriculture on. So you had to trade was the only way to kind of sustain life in that. And it's why places like Crete got so powerful. It's because they are actually big enough to have like sustained agriculture and like just much more wealth inherent to the island itself. So yeah, it's interesting because Circe, I think at first blush is again one of those horror stories, but it's almost a similar one to Polyphemus where it's the horror of guest rights being violated. Because that's what the Cyclops is. You know, they show up and, you know, you're supposed to be hosted. And the whole dramatic twist, if you're listening to this in ancient Greek, is okay, we do guest rights, we show up, he's hosting, we brought gifts of wine, and it's dinner time, and the dramatic horror twist is, and dinner is you. Like, versus Circe, it's interesting because it's sort of more this like sending men off and then they don't come back. So it's like, okay, then we got to send more off. They don't come back, we're going to go. And I do think it is sort of a more existential fear of, again, what happens when the people we have dehumanized now get the power to dehumanize us. So in that way, it sort of had to almost be an equalization, like of power by the end. But at the same time, she helps them along and she's sort of their point of knowledge for the rest of the story because she's the one that kind of guides them past a lot of the coming obstacles.
Right. That phrase, like what happens when the people we dehumanize have the power to dehumanize us, I think is a great way to think about the rest of this book in relation to what Circe is going to do for us in the Sea of Monsters. Because that feels like a lesson that Percy doesn't really think about until much later in the books, but that he is maybe a little bit more woke to in the TV show. So I'm curious what Circe will offer us in the TV show if it isn't necessarily that thought. Because that thought does kind of already happen in the Medusa episode in season 1. Not that there isn't more room to explore it further, but he does seem like a kid who has been already thinking about those things, you know, in the series as opposed to in the book.
Yeah. So I'm really excited to see what they do with Tyson in the series too, because I know there's so much with the monstrosity in the book.
Yeah. I like that as also an alternative way into understanding the Odyssey in general, as opposed to just it being about like fatal flaws and our own fatal flaws. It's more thinking about like externally, like what about all of these monsters? Who were they beforehand that we dehumanized so much that they became quote unquote these horror stories that we have to face? I like that. Okay, wait, do you have any more further questions on that, Carter, before we get into?
I think we should get into it.
That was very helpful. Emily, thank you for that framing.
I hope it was actually helpful.
I think it was. I think it was very helpful for us to understand because like my entire kind of understanding of this character is just from reading The Sea of Monsters as a kid and then reading this book. So it's helpful to understand from a different, older perspective. This book opens with the lines, "When I was born, the name for what I was did not exist." The idea of her being the first witch ever, the first of her name, the first person to be able to do this, like there wasn't a name for quote unquote witch yet, has always confused me because Later on, when Aedes returns
Mhm.
and is like, when were you going to figure out you were a witch? Doesn't make it feel like she's actually the first one. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And they also specifically already have a name for it, you know?
Yes, like it's a word that she doesn't make up the word pharmaca, which we'll talk about.
It's like mentioned by older people and
Yeah.
her siblings. And
So how do you guys interpret this line?
There's a few different paths I can go down. I will say pharmaca and like pharmakoios. That's like a different suffix, instrumental suffix, I think, where it's basically someone who does something. So it's possible that that's sort of what's meant by that. Although I did actually, when she mentioned the like the origin of her name means hawk, or is it falcon?
Hawk.
I did look it up because I was curious. And apparently, for those who don't know, like ancient Greek is related to a few different other branches of languages that all kind of sum up, including Latin and Sanskrit and Old Norse. And apparently, it has some cognates in like specifically like Icelandic and Old Norse that do mean like witch, basically, like the name Circe, which means that probably at some point, like way early back, there was a word that kind of descended into Circe, or I think the Old Norse. Oh gosh, I don't know how to pronounce. Ygir, something. I never took a Germanic language, besides English. But it indicates there's some origin there of her name, literally meaning something like witch, maybe.
I think that initial insight also is helpful. That idea that like even if pharmaca exists, the idea of your identity being intertwined with that set of objects or practices is itself like potentially an intervention. Or the second idea being that like even if people had names for this kind of thing, that she is so like you don't have to be the first to be the one.
Yeah, she is the most famous.
Do you remember this, Erica? When we were in 8th grade, we had a substitute teacher who would go on to be our teacher for European history through philosophy. And he like did the classic English substitute thing that you do with a class of middle schoolers, where he's like, okay, we're reading Shakespeare right now. Like, class, who do you think was the person who like invented what romance is? And we were sitting around being like, what is this person talking about? What the hell? You can't invent an abstract concept. That's ridiculous. And he kept like talking to us about it. And then he was like, Shakespeare invented romance, because basically everything you know about love, like it might as well have not existed before then, because he created this whole, like, you know, like, he did all of that. Basically, this idea that like it might as well not matter if people did it before you, if all of the you know genealogies trace back to you.
And if you're the one who they tell the stories about.
Yeah, I do a little bit feel like it's maybe not super. I don't know. Like all of these explanations to me feel like consistent with culture and maybe not consistent with the literal events that happen in this text. And maybe that's okay.
I feel like that is very Homeric to me, though. Like rereading this now is interesting because I'm noticing a lot more the way the storytelling I feel like feels a lot like the Iliad and the Odyssey, but like specifically for those kinds of quirks of like it being kind of non-linear, where we're going to follow the thread of this one story about the amber beads all the way to the end, even though it skips way ahead and we're going to get there. And like also all of the sort of nature metaphors. And I think like there's inconsistencies in the Iliad and the Odyssey all the time of like who's son, who's what's going on with the gods and everything. So, and it's interesting because like so much of Greek myth is from this just like miasma of reference, where there's so many characters that have so many different stories depending on where you are or who's telling it.
Thinking about this maybe not making sense chronologically, but culturally, we get to know her in this book through her narration and what she chooses to say when, just as much as the actual events that take place and the dialogue. That the way she describes her own life and speaks about her younger self and what she chooses to tell us and maybe doesn't choose to tell us tells us just as much as the things she's actually telling us.
Yeah.
So starting out your own story being like, when I was born, the name for what I was did not exist. Badass.
Yeah.
Badass.
To me, my immediate question was like, where does that leave Hecate, I wonder? And the answer is nowhere. She's not mentioned in the book, period.
So I think in mythology, she's actually the son of Percy, like Circe's brother.
Oh.
That's one of the...
Okay.
Hecate has a lot of different origins.
Right.
I actually did a deep dive on her when we covered Wrath, and this is where I tin hat a little bit about origins of gods specifically is something that fascinates me, because I'm always like, where did they come from? But like, actually, where did they come from? And there's some theories of her being like a earth goddess originally from like Thrace or something, from like somewhere that's sort of not part of Greece, or sort of would have become absorbed eventually. And then there's a lot of like catch-all gods. Like there's a really popular theory that Athena is not like, because the people we know of as the ancient Greeks are not indigenous to Greece. So there's this interesting theory that Athena is actually named after Athens instead of the other way around. And she was sort of this patron goddess of the city that as it rose to prominence, their patron goddess kind of got folded into this whole story.
The Wikipedia page about Circe also suggests something similar, that she had her own individualist cult that sort of got folded in at some point later on.
Yeah, which, I mean, it makes sense. Like, I mean, if you think about it, right? Like, if you live in a mountain valley, you're really rarely gonna talk to people outside your valley, you know? Like, maybe there's one bard that comes by every once in a while, and then they'll come in and be like, okay, I'm gonna tell the stories about this valley so that you know, give me tips and like me. That's sort of how all of these different ideas and myths sort of kind of come together. And then at some point you've got people who, once they've got more established like communication, tearing their hair out like, okay, but which is the right one? What was real history? Because if you don't think there weren't ancient Greeks being like, okay, I'm going to make a timeline. Let's figure out exactly what year this all happened. You're wrong. They did, because they're just like us.
I just wanted to also echo the point about the form you were making, Erica, and how it relates to, I guess, the American feminist tradition classic of like autobiography as theory type of model, that like it's not what the character would be doing, in the sense that the character is not trying to like learn from Audre Lorde or something, but like it seems like very clearly that that's the reference that they're trying to make, that it's not just a novel, it is an novel
account.
sort of in form of like a feminist autobiography.
Yeah.
That also begins with this fascinating line about how nymphs are supposed to be linguistically brides. I had never heard this before, but it is like one of the first things that she says is basically like, this is who I was supposed to be. This is what I actually am.
Which is why I was really passionate about this being our first section of this book, even though it's a really large section, because when you pointed that out, Carter, the idea that like she is like born into what she should be is a nymph or a bride, but what she actually is didn't exist when she was born. And at the very end of this section, at the end of chapter 6, chapter 6 ends with her looking at this tapestry of a wedding on her wall and saying, I'm leaving that tapestry behind. And it feels kind of at first very, very random. Like, what are you talking about? This random, like, I don't know what this is. It's like a painting of like some relative's wedding. And she's like, I don't need that with me in my exile. But it is her rejecting that identity as a bride and like any chance at like normal domesticity or tradition that would be expected of her, and entering into her exile era of being her true self.
That's sort of the thing too. It's like, what are the roles of women in this society? And that was something else that like reading through all of these chapters I found really interesting, was like how much the world of the gods does reflect the mortal world and vice versa.
Yes. A lot of what we're getting in this first section is just establishing what it means to be a Titan, the relationship between the Titans and the Olympians, what godly life is, so that we can understand why she's so fascinated by mortality and by mortals. Like the idea that she doesn't have to sleep, but she does. This passage about novelty, conditions constraining, they were novelties to my father, and gods love nothing more than novelty. She's making all these observations about like the society that she's in, that she thinks is kind of like vapid and whatnot, but in many ways it also does apply to her. She's going to also be fascinated by novelty and the idea of pain and the idea of suffering, because these are things that she's not used to.
Yeah. These first chapters honestly remind me so much of Lord.
The singer?
Yeah. I think we're going to follow the space, and we might see as we move forward that Circe and Lord's journeys are close mirrors for each other as told in this book. Because I really feel like this set of 6 chapters is giving the original Lord album. And the next set might be giving melodrama a bit.
You think this is pure heroine?
I think it is pure heroine. This
like suffering in your suburb?
It is suffering in a suburb and finding everyone around you vapid and horrifying, and having like huge emotions about things that will come to not define your life. Like the whole little mini journey she goes on with Aedes is something that like obviously matters later on, but he's gonna like, spoiler, like he like is huge, and Glaukos is also gonna loom huge over these sections, and will kind of like, I don't know, like she stops caring about it after a while eventually. Maybe not. I'm gonna keep following the space.
I'm gonna add on to that space that I do find this beginning section very hard to read. It's the hardest part of the book for me, because it is so teen angsty because in that similar way of like growing up in your suburb, everybody around you is insufferable, but you're also kind of insufferable because you don't know any better. And you think you're the first person. There's that great line about being the first.
Yeah.
On page 43, that is the one thing gods and mortals share. When we are young, we think ourselves the first to have each feeling in the world. Everything into like hating her siblings and like being shunned by her uncles and everything, and then like falling in love for the first time with Glaucus. It's all so embarrassing, and it all hurts so bad. And it's so awful. It's so hard watching her be so passive and so insecure and so hard on herself.
I think that's the perspective that reminds me of pure heroine. It's this person being like it's the idea of being stuck in your head and so kind of full of critique of the people around you, but also being kind of stuck there with them. To me, the innovation of pure heroine is that she's not critiquing them from a place of superiority. She's critiquing them from the place of being like, I am younger and I'm also like making kind of a lot of these same mistakes, and I don't actually know what the alternative to any of this is. And that's like, I feel like that is the great difficulty of this section for Circe, is that like all of her critiques are ringing true, and it is really hard to watch, for instance, her sisters who were tending Helios's herd be so like mindless and tortured and, you know, making this huge ado about nothing. And she is kind of critiquing them, but also like she isn't in a place to do any better, and her life conditions are worse, and she's not like she's not like bowing down and tripping over herself to serve her father, but she's also like her whole life revolves around him anyway, and she's just lying on the floor waiting for him to get home. And
so she can sit at his feet, which I think is just such a juicy description that keeps coming back and forth, because I think of her like being like literally tiny and like sitting at his feet and only coming up to his knees. But her life would continue to be like that. She would continue to be stuck in the suburbs of New Zealand if it weren't for her super cool teacher, high school English teacher mentor, Prometheus, coming in and showing her that there's a better way, that not all gods need be the same. I just love how Prometheus is here for 0.2 seconds and he changes the entire course of her life. And part of me hates that it's a man, but there was no other option. And that she needed that one person in her life to like show her that things can be different. And then that sets her off on this entirely different life path.
Yeah, I really enjoy that edition of Prometheus. I actually love the beginning of this book, and it's, I think because I'm a world building girly, not a character girly. So I'm just sitting here like, ooh, and then they're talking around the fire of the glories of days past. Like, it paints such a rich world that is something that is not in mythology proper. So I love the like expanding of it and the expanding of like the characters of all of these that feels very close to what I've read. Like, it's not a radically different or too modern take that kind of takes me out. It like lets me fit it neatly into the mythology I know and love. And I just love this like bringing of Prometheus into the story of just like, of course, like that would be the big thing that would happen that is new, that's different to these characters.
It kind of reminds me of what you were saying earlier about the, I guess, timeline and genealogic, perhaps, inconsistencies of Homeric texts. Because my initial reaction when we first saw him was like, I don't think this makes sense. This is totally not jiving with
like,
my
this should be
model
such a
about
long
the
time
timeline.
earlier.
This should have predated everything by such a huge amount, but also like it fits so well, and I think almost. Because like this happens in chapter 2, and that forcing function of being like, okay, don't hold on too tight, you know? I think that is useful for establishing the tone and the approach of the book, and saying, you know, the formation of Circe's logics and personhood is going to be more important than whatever ideas you have about when people are doing things.
Yeah. While we're on Prometheus, her fixating on him as her like manic pixie English teacher inspiration for the rest of her life, she only mentions this one interaction she had with him twice to two people. She mentions it to Adys and to Glaucus, and both times they shut her down and they're like, shut up. Like, Adys is like, you should never talk about that again, that's really dangerous. And Glaucus is like, oh my god, you're so old. And those are different kinds of shutdowns. But I thought it was so important to see her be so passionate about something and like harbor the secret and this thing that is so close to her and that feels so intertwined with her like budding personality and her desires, and for her to be vulnerable enough with those two men to mention it and then them both to immediately shut her down. So hard to read. Proof that they are not the ones for her, and that she needs in the future these very heady intellectual men who she's going to be able to share these thoughts and feelings with. It was very telling that even though Adis, in her perspective in this first part of the book, kind of seems like an ally, that he is not. And that is one of the first things that tips us off, that he is not this loving brother and confidant that she feels that he is.
Yeah. I think there's something so important about the fact that she raised him too. And how that is our introduction to him. Again, it feels very pertinent to like womanhood.
Yeah, and especially like this Prometheus section is essentially like our introduction to how, more or less, it's telling us how power works here, right? It is laying out the order of the Titans and the Olympians and the nymphs and everything, and confirming
the chain
how
of
that
fear
works. The chain of fear, exactly. And it's placing mortals into that as well, which is going to be an important intervention. And then later on, I think all of the conversations we have, like every time she tries to bring it up, it is this manifestation and realization of like that power dynamic that we're supposed to be learning about, and like what curiosities there are at the edges, where Aedes' response is basically, this is how it is. Why are you perturbing things? You need to understand this and just
work within
do your
the system.
best. Work within the system, etc. And Glaucus' reaction is kind of just like shutting down, not having really any curiosity.
I think what it also brings out is like he has no concept of like immortality at that point, because he's just like,
yeah, because he does know that she's immortal, like abstractly. He refers to her as a goddess. Yes,
yeah.
It just isn't clicking for him. He doesn't have the I don't know, the math laid out or something.
I also found it very interesting while we're talking about her breaking out of that system for the first time, or like escaping her suburbs, that Helios's palace is described as being underground, and she's literally underground, cannot see the sun, even though her father is the sun. Underground, cannot see the sun, and then it is Aedes, her brother, who, with him, they go to like an island up in the sun, and they find like their own shore to like spend time together, and he like opens her eyes to the ways of the world and like pushes her boundaries and asks her all these questions. What does your divinity feel like? Talking to her about all these things. He is the one who is pulling her out of the cave, literally. They're going up out of Plato's cave underground into the sunlight, and she's seeing the way that the world is.
It is a little bit tough, the idea that she's being led by a man who fundamentally doesn't know as much about the world as her. But like there are like in-universe reasons for this. Like she talks about how he is given access to Helios's sort of intimate conversations in a way that she is not. So it makes sense that he would be able to learn these things. And also it does, like, at the risk of incriminating my sister, who obviously like in many ways is not like Aedes and is not, you know, a criminal trying to run a kingdom in the shadows. I can relate to the idea of, you know, having a raucous, rule-breaking, non-permission asking younger sibling who just kind of like finds things out that it would not occur to you to find out, because you I don't know, you're doing your own thing. You're chugging along in life.
And even though you kind of raised them, they suddenly know more than you do.
Yeah,
and are asking questions that you never...
and they can still expose you to new things despite having different limitations. I don't know. Yeah. The idea of this experience kind of rang true for me, despite some of these ways in which it's not neat as a clean feminist narrative.
Let's do a quick break and then we'll come back to cover some Glaucus. Oh, this is so hard. It's so hard. He doesn't see her as a person. It's very difficult. Like I said, with her bringing up Prometheus to him as like this like deepest, darkest secret, and him immediately freaking out and being like, "You're old." It's all very hard. It's all very girlhood. You know, if this story is the Bible specifically for women, as Emily said, I can incorporate all of our words into one. This book is the Bible about what it means to be a mortal woman. We have to have the really awful, painful first love experience. This man who doesn't think she's a person. And it's all very hard. The thing that I find most interesting for the rest of the book and like the consequences of the rest of the book is when she's doing this magic, there's a conversation about whether or not her magic can change the true soul of somebody, like someone's true identity. Are you actually changing who they are, or have they always been that way? Is your magic just bringing out their true nature? And that is something I don't know that I have an answer for.
Yeah, I really love, I mean, to skip all the way to the end of chapter 6, like when Aeetes brings us up with her and it kind of introduces that question of like, is it you or is it fate and is it destiny?
Yes.
But what I will say is there is a sort of predetermination almost of names and Greek myth, because so much of it is the name is not like we hear a name of a thing in another language and are just like, yes, of course, a name. But like, again, most of these names are like descriptors of the actual functions and things. Like hyacinthus, for example, becomes a hyacinth.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a certain element of that in a lot of Greek myth that I think is something that is a little lost in translation, that is kind of interesting, but it can almost go both ways as well. So I feel like I'm talking myself into a bit of a circle. But like, it's like, are they named after them, or are they it? Are they the embodiment of that?
And with Glaukos' name meaning like bright and shining.
Yeah.
And is he actually?
Yeah. His story's an interesting one though, because he's, he starts mortal in all the stories of him. And I think Glaucus is like a pretty common name in ancient Greece. I remember there's like a famous story of a guy at the Olympics named Glaucus who like wins a boxing match. It's like a mortal name in a sense. I don't know. It is an interesting question. I think the aspect of change and metamorphosis is something that's so intrinsically linked to sorcery and witchcraft that I think that a kind of exploration of it is so much of what this book is trying to answer.
Yeah. Carter, what do you think about whether or not her magic is bringing out her own will and putting her own will upon them?
I think it's an interesting question, but also not one that we really are given space to do anything with other than meditate.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't feel like she's doing enough transformations that we get like a full... I don't know. It's not like it's something you can test empirically throughout the text. It's
a soft magic system, one would say.
Yeah.
She wanted Glaukos to be hot, and so he became hot, but unfortunately inside he was just an a-hole. And she wanted Scylla to be disgusting, and she became disgusting, but inside she was still a bad bitch. Yeah, you're right. We can't know. I just thought it was interesting because we don't really get a real answer when like everyone is being like, you can't change fate. And then her brother is like, I can raise people from the dead. You can do whatever you want,
Yeah.
And what magic actually does, we don't know, but that's fine.
It's good. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
If this book is the Bible and feminine story structure spiraling around these ideas of like what it means to be a human mortal, each of those words is capitalized, then the like parable of this section is the end of childhood and like what it means to recognize your circumstances are crappy, seek out something more, try your hand at changing fate and taking fate into your own hands, realizing that means that there are consequences, and then having to make the decision about whether or not you're going to take accountability for those consequences. And she makes that very important decision to confess to being the one who changed Scylla.
Both of them,
yeah.
She confesses to Scylla because that's the horror, but then she also is a part of it, is convincing to Glaucus as well.
I wonder if the accountability, I mean, it's interesting how the Prometheus effect kind of plays into that as well, because she's seen consequences.
I feel like consequences is a way of framing it, but like one of the core ideas of this section of chapters is that for a woman, monstrosity is freeing.
Yes. Yes.
And that's like part of what's going on here. Even though Prometheus' situation is not a perfect analog, obviously Prometheus is not a woman. He was never constrained by weaknesses and more powerful individuals in really the same way as Circe ever. But I think this idea that like punishment has limits is definitely something we're taking away from that experience, and that there are worse things than being in pain, like not, I don't know, having experiences and living authentically. I don't like the mushy direction I'm going as far as like imprecision and be who you are for your pride of it all. But like, I think that is kind of what's going on.
I see it though, because to me that links to agency, where it's like, who is the Titan that's actually had the most impact on the mortal world or the world in general since their overthrowing, and it's Prometheus.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think he's punished for it, but I think that's sort of what you're saying though, is it's like, what is the cost of agency, and is it worth it in this world? And I think Circe is sort of, that's opening her eyes a bit to it, bringing the fire, if you will.
Speaking of monstrosity, I do hate that it's Aides who points this out, but this is such an excellent lesson for her to learn at the end of this first section, at the end of her childhood, before she like rejects domesticity and any hope of a traditional future. This is one of my favorite passages of the entire book. It's on page 71, talking about how she transformed Scylla and feels bad about it. He says to her, even the most beautiful nymph is largely useless, and an ugly one would be nothing. Less than nothing. She would never marry or produce children. She would be a burden to her family, a stain upon the face of the world. She would live in the shadows, scorned and reviled. But a monster, she always has a place. She may have all the glory her teeth can snatch. She will not be loved for it, but she will not be constrained either. So whatever foolish sorrow you harbor, forget it. I think it may be said that you improved her.
It is kind of tough to hear him say this because he is kind of like full unmasked, unvarnished. Like he is insufferable. But I think that's part of what makes him such an interesting character, is that they have this kind of former close relationship that we all understand is not close anymore and is never going to be close anymore. And that comes with this realness. Like, he does actually have a lot of insights that he's sharing. And I think the fact that he is so abrasive and can say something like this and not feel any type of way about it particularly is what I think allows it to go down and not feel detached or saccharine or unreal or anything.
I also just love getting that out of the way at the very beginning, at least at the end of the first section of this book. Let's just get that out of the way, just so we're all clear. The only true freedom for a woman is monstrosity, is to be so far away from the norm that you can finally escape all of those constraints. Let's get that clear now. Let's let you learn that now so that we can all just move forward from that and like acknowledge that as like the base truth.
Her being an outsider and being an outsider in general is so connected to being a sorceress, I think, like in mythology for that exact reason. It's just like you have to exist on the fringes over here as like a threat. Although I will say the last word where he says you improved her is the one where I feel like that kind of takes you back to like, oh, I was agreeing with you until just now.
And now we're trying to put our will onto other people, and now we're maybe getting into a little bit of a
not everybody likes Kleos, you know? Some people want Nostos.
And that is a great question as well. Trying to put that onto this book, which is like so like not necessarily interested in that, but what it means for her to make her own home in exile as we're like heading there. I was going to do my like monstrosity women rapid book plug, Women and Other Monsters by Jess Zimmerman and Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huang. If you're fascinated by those ideas, you should just go read those books right now. But we're coming to the end of our time, and we're about to like go out into exile because Circe is nothing if not just a political pawn in the ever-brewing war between the Titans and the Olympians. Emily, is there anything you want to say to us about Pharmaca and what's the other word?
There's Pharmaca. Well, there's a bunch of them, honestly. There's a bunch of different endings. There's Pharmakos. If you want to do the Greek way, it's a flipped R. So the main thing about the Pharmaca that's, I think, really important, it does actually relate a lot to agency in like kind of our last conversation. Because you see the word pop up a ton. When I took like a Greek lyric poetry class, I distinctly remember my professor gave like an entire lecture on this because it's such an interesting and sort of pervasive concept. Because we were reading Hesiod, who did Theogony and Works and Days, and how there's almost an interesting duality of like sorcery to medicine and like how you see that kind of play out across. But basically what Pharmaca are in mythology, it seems, specifically like the feminine, like the A ending as opposed to pharmakos, is specifically drugs that have power over the gods. So it kind of in that way can inspire an actual fear in the gods themselves. And it's just such an interesting thing that even like kind of baked into mythology, there is just sort of this innate power. And in a way, it almost kind of feels reminiscent of like the Norse gods, because I think the Norse gods in their mythology are way more vulnerable than, you know, Greek gods and Roman gods.
Killable.
Yeah. The idea of Circe being able to use witchcraft in that way, like, I think you just need to understand the depths of the power she holds, because it's not just like using magic. It's specifically magic that is able to change things in a way that makes the gods afraid. And that's sort of, I think, when like her siblings are doing it and everything, and there's all of that, like that's the reason why it's such a big deal and so important. I think it's also something that's so related to these characters, as I've talked about, where, you know, it's always the women. There's such an interesting history of like medicine in the ancient world too, which we do not have time to get into, but that's sort of the short version of why Circe and why this book is so important. And I think the power over what seems to have all of the power. So such an elegant way to finish that. But anyway.
I like the idea that Circe is somebody who makes the gods afraid, trying to think about how we could use this book to help us understand the Sea of Monsters. Like, what about Percy Jackson makes the gods afraid? He doesn't have magic. But what is similar between the two of them that sparks that fear, you know?
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's like the metaphorical agency. Like, I feel like there's also a strong connection of like reproductive power with witchcraft, like being sort of traditional. Like, I mean, that's sort of power over life and death in that way.
Shout out to The Acolyte, which nobody can watch anymore, but shout out to The Acolyte anyway. We love asexually reproducing lesbian witches in space.
We really do.
Yeah, but like contraception and all of that for so long was sort of kind of in that realm always. And a fun fact, the ancient Greek world had a very effective contraceptive called silphium. And do you know what its seeds were shaped as?
Eggs? Little hearts? Little hearts?
That's the seed.
Emily's making a heart gesture with her hands.
It's the heart shape. That's the seed of a contraceptive plant.
That's amazing.
You can still watch The Acolyte also.
Yeah, there's just like, I think there's always such a connection between all of that. And so it's like power over gods, but specifically also, I think, all the stuff I was talking about at the beginning of just like women.
Women. I just think that women.
I do, frequently, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's childhood. That's the end of childhood. That is our embarrassing life in the suburbs of New Zealand, aka underground in Helios's palace. That's like your first love. That's discovering you're a witch for the first time. That's raising your little brother only for him to turn out to be an a-hole, but who still teaches you things. Manic Pixie English teachers. And we're going to go to Exile in the next section. I have to say, our outline for this episode was pretty long, and we didn't necessarily hit everything that I had written down in there. So if you want to see our outlines, you can go to our Patreon and sign up for the tier of our Patreon where I post our outlines for you to read if you want extra content. Otherwise, Emily, will you let people know where they can find you if they want to hear more about medicine in ancient Greece?
Yes. So I'm one of the co-hosts of Monster Donut, which is a Percy Jackson podcast. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts, at PJOpod on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. And my co-host Phoebe does some great art, so you should check that out. I always shout that out because she's amazing and doesn't talk about herself.
Wahoo! Shout out to Emily, shout out to Phoebe. Any final thoughts? Anything we missed that anyone's like dying to get out about the first 6 chapters of Circe before we close out here?
I think we will not routinely be able to cover everything. But
I was going to say, an hour is crazy. I was sad we had to skip the Minos Palace bit, but...
yeah, we totally skipped past it. We'll have more time. I'm only working for another 2 weeks.
You'll get back to Minos.
Yeah, we'll get back.
he'll be around.
The one thing I felt passionately about that we didn't get to say is that when Circe decides that she wants to do magic and she has no idea where to start, she starts asking people questions and she starts pulling stories out of people. Yeah. Stories and rumors and stories out of family members and uncles, because stories are knowledge. Knowledge is power. And whenever people want to defund libraries and ban books, that is a sign that they're trying to keep power from you. And we just need to keep that in mind forever.
Yes.
Maybe donate to NPR today.
Yes.
Oof. You don't have to become a patron of Seaweed Brain if you become an NPR subscriber. You could do that today. Go ahead. Okay, we'll see everybody next time for chapters, I should know this, I think it's 7 through 11. Thank you for being here. Bye.
Bye, all.
Bye.